In a meeting with Prince Brian later that day, she laid out the scope of what they faced in recovering the person of Princess Irene. The prince went back to his kingdom and sought out an audience with Stevniak the Great, a wizard of great renown. He lived in a cave guarded by the dragon Bruce. Bruce was looking into a mirror the size of a house and combing his eyelashes when the prince approached. The prince bowed low and stated his case. The dragon put down the mirror and straightened up a bit, saying, "We're here in time for office hours. Go right in, but remember, after 5, I eat anything that moves." Rather than the standard robe covered with stars and a pointed wizard's hat, Stevniak wore sneakers, jeans, and a black pullover shirt. If it was especially cold, he would sometimes put on a mackintosh. Scattered all around were bits and pieces from his latest experiments. Apparently he was trying to make a lap dog with a small computer screen atop its back. Depending on where you pet the dog, the cursor would move. A scratch on the head was the same as a left click, and so on. It was aimed at matronly types who so far had disdained any contact with the internet. Prince Brian, I've been expecting you, and I've been thinking about you and the princess." Prince Brian said, "Is there any hope?" The wizard looked grave. "Well," he said, "there is and there isn't. We may find her, but the minute we do, Ankal could make her vanish again. First, we need to determine if she's living or dead." "How can that be done?" the prince asked. "It's not we, I'm afraid. It's going to be just you, if you're willing." The prince drew himself up to his full height and was about to speak when the wizard said, "Yes, I see you'll do it. You may have regrets along the way, but you'll do it." 2 nights later, the prince stood by the graveyard gate at midnight. He carried on his person only such things as the wizard had given him, plus a few items belonging to the princess. He wore a charm around his neck that permitted transit into the realm of the dead. He could see a cloud of dust in the distance, and then his eyes made out a coach. He could hear the horse's hooves and heard the driver crack his whip. When they got closer, he saw that it was a team of 6 pulling the coach, and as big and as strong as they were, he could see right through them. The driver was a decomposed cadaver with a hideous grin. Boarding the coach were the shades of those who died since the last time the coach had passed this way. Prince Brian boarded and felt a deep chill settle into his bones. The coach traveled around the world and made countless stops to take on passengers. There was no danger the coach would become full, for the dead occupied only a slight space. 1,000 might fit into a thimble. The ride seemed to take forever, but the prince knew the journey would be ended before the sun arose. All the while, the prince held the princess's hanky in his hand to see if it would glow and tell him that she was near, but alas, it never changed. They drove along a river, and a ferry slip came into view. There was a ferry similar in size to the coach. He knew this to be the final transit point between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Once one crossed over that river, there was no turning back. The far side was guarded by the 3-headed hound Cerberus, who had recently been adopted by the dog dentists as their logo, because Cerberus could brush, floss, and rinse all at the same time. The faceless ferryman knew the prince to be mortal. He held up his staff to block his path. But the prince held up the hanky belonging to the princess and made a show of smelling it, and the ferryman understood. A great basset hound was summoned, who came to the coach and sniffed the hanky in the prince's hand. The dog then slowly shook his head. A person with that scent had not taken the journey to the far side. The princess was still among the living. Thelma had taken the princess into her home, such as it was. The floor was dirt. The roof was made of thatch. Several of the chickens were accustomed to come in looking for scraps should the door be left open. A fire was always burning for both heat and cooking. She stored the clothes the princess was wearing in a wicker chest and gave her an old cotton dress and a smock to go over it. "If you want better, I'm afraid you'll have to learn how to sew." The princess thanked her and very soon looked the part of a poor country wench. Thelma's oldest daughter was Cedar, and she was a good spinner who had the proper feel for the pull and twist needed to turn the sheep's wool into yarn. She gave the princess some instruction and then watched her spin. She was a little awkward at first, but it quickly became apparent she'd spun before. While the princess had no memory of it, it had been her nursemaid who'd instructed her years and years before. Once you've done it, the hand and the mind remember. Before the week was over, she learned to keep the fire going, feed the pigs and chickens, and milk the cow. She also wore a garment she'd stitched together with Cedar's help. It wasn't one that could be sold on market day, but still it was a clever design and suited her. The prince slept a fitful sleep after his encounter with the dead. Then he again met with the wizard and Zarpi. "If Ankal has cast the princess into another time, how can we find her?" The wizard made a pass with his hand, and his M-screen shimmered into view. He called up the image of a flowing river. "Here," he said, "we have something very much like time. Can either of you tell me what it looks like upstream?" Zarpi responded, "I can't tell you because I can't see upstream." "Then what about downstream?" he asked next. The prince shook his head. "Well, there it is. Ankal can't see beyond her own life. What happened before she existed is unknown, and the future is unknown to us all. So the magic with regard to time covers a limited span." Zarpi spoke up. "That is still a lot of time." The wizard agreed. "I would guess at least 200 years, but less than 300. "I will still find the princess," the prince declared. The wizard caused the image to magnify a spot of rough water and said, "A person's time can be peaceful or turbulent, just like these waters. If I throw a stick into the calm, steady flow of a river, I can pretty well predict where it will go. Should I toss it into the rapids, it might go downstream. It might be cast upon the bank, or become wedged between rocks. Very unpredictable. This is by way of saying that the spell Ankal cast upon the princess took her to a peaceful time in Ankal's own life. I say this because I think she intends to bring the princess back for reasons only she knows." The prince then looked at Zarpi and asked, "So when does a witch have a peaceful time in her life?" Zarpi blushed a bit and then answered, "It must be in childhood, just before one starts to understand the cares of one's elders." "Well put," said the wizard. In the cave, light cast many shadows, but there was one shadow for which there was no corresponding person or object. It was the figure of a fairy holding a violin. The wizard spoke to it. "Stephanie, I have a task for you." The shadow took a bow. "Fly off to the home of Ankal the witch and play her tunes sweet to her ears. Then bring me back her dreams." The shadow could briefly be seen moving across the walls of the cave and was quickly gone. Ankal was in a contemplative mood. She'd long wondered where her powers came from and had at last decided they came from those who believed in witches. The invisible forces were little more than what the common folk believed. If enough believed, there was power for her magic. She heard a faint tune. It was a violin playing the Danse Macabre by Saint-Saëns, the Dance of Death. It had always been her favorite. She mused, "Shall I go on forever? Might I come to my end? Perhaps there is something across that final river for me." She stirred the coals under her cauldron and added a few pieces of wood. She waved her hands, clearing the vapor away, and called forth a vision. There was the princess in the countryside that Ankal had known as a girl. She felt her cold heart flutter a bit with longing for what was long gone. She thought, what else might I have become? Her sister had given up witchcraft to become the wife of a red state senator. Couldn't get more evil than that.